When a honeymooning couple sets out on a remote Hawaiian hike, they soon realize they're being hunted by someone who wants to clamp them, and they may be closer than they think. We start out watching different recordings from a wedding. After the wedding, we now see the newlyweds, Cliff and Sydney Anderson, alone on their honeymoon. They're in a car now, and Cliff is talking about how he got this scar from his brother, who hit him with his skateboard when he was 9. They're now in a helicopter making videos and taking pictures. They're really having the time of their lives on this honeymoon in Hawaii. It's almost like it's the perfect getaway. That's the name of the movie, by the way. Later, they arrive at this store and the tire of their cars runs over this newspaper on the floor. It seems irrelevant at first, but then they get into the store, and as Cliff is getting a permit to visit some areas in Hawaii from the guy over the counter, they notice some guy come in, but nothing happens, so they head back out to the car. As they drive away, we see the front page of the newspaper flip over, and guess what the headline is? Young couple butchered in Honolulu. Oh boy, things are about to get messy. But for now, it's beautiful. They're singing as they drive, and Cliff even stops for some hitchhikers by the road, something he normally wouldn't have done, but you know, it's Hawaii. Sydney's not in support, but it's already too late. Cliff has already stopped, and the hitchhikers, Kale and Cleo, have already entered their truck. I bet his dad's name is Broccoli. Cliff gets a look at Kale and the tattoo on his chest, and he begins to change his mind about dropping them off. But again, too late. Cleo doesn't seem ready to get off the truck, but she actually doesn't force herself on them. She shows them a couple pictures from their own recent wedding and honeymoon, and that's enough to put Sydney's mind at ease. They say, what the hell, let's go. But now Kale doesn't want to go anymore. He yells at Cleo to get down. Cliff and Sydney just had their way. They tried. Back to their perfect getaway. They're taking a hike now. Sydney nearly falls down a cliff, but Cliff was there to hold her. Funny sentence. Actually, it was this stranger that held her, but Cliff's name was just perfect for that sentence. Imagine saying Nick was there to hold her, when Cliff is right there. Anyway, Cliff, Sydney, and Nick continue their adventure together, and they start telling each other about themselves. Cliff is a screenwriter and he's having problems at work. Apparently, they brought in someone to rewrite his story, and now he's been left out of the project. Nick advises him to get a new agent. The guy moves ahead with their exploration of Hawaii, and they meet 3 ladies. One of the ladies tells them that her dad just called talking about some murders that just happened in Oahu. Reception here is terrible, so they can't even confirm the news. But Sydney says, what the heck? It happened in Oahu, not here. They're good. She's going to go ahead and enjoy her honeymoon. But the mention of honeymoon makes the ladies uneasy. It seems they got the memo that the murderers are newlyweds, so they just run off. You're running away from the wrong couple, girls. Or are they? Anyway, Nick, Sydney, and Cliff go ahead. They stop somewhere and Cliff sees Cleo and Kale down by the water, but he doesn't say anything. He just joins Nick and Sydney. They get to a waterfall and there's a woman just floating on the water. Nick quickly goes in to join her. He introduces her as Gina, the love of his life. The, poorly dressed couple encourage the newlyweds to join them in the water. Sydney joins in while Cliff takes off to go find some reception on his phone, and he does get some. He immediately Googles the murders and he can see the articles. He's reading through everything, and just when he clicks on the photos of the suspects, which the police released, he looks up and sees Kale and Cleo right in front of him. Foreshadowing? Kale is talking about the different deaths that happen out here every year. Cliff straight up asks Kale if they've been following them. Kale says something about how sometimes it feels like the whole world is just spitting in his face. Cliff is now telling him he doesn't know what Kale's issue with him is. He offered them a ride and they refuse to take it. As they're talking, Nick shows up and that's enough to break up the conversation. Both pairs go their separate ways. But before they leave, Kale mentions some places they'll be heading to from here. Cliff says they'll need permits to access those places and Kale just smiles. Nick and Cliff head back just as the ladies are getting dressed. Sydney sees Kale and Cleo's bag in the distance, and she asks Cliff if they're safe. He says everything is cool, but then he checks in his bag for his permits and he can't find them. He immediately heads for Kale's bag and starts searching through it. He finds a card which belongs to Ernesto Padillo, a parole agent. I don't believe he found anything else. The 4 of them now leave. They're taking a walk now and are having random conversations about movies, actors, Hollywood, you know, random irrelevant stuff. Nick says he's an American Jedi and tells some stories about his adventures, which he wants Cliff to write a movie about. He even shows them a scar on his head and then a knife he always carries around. These things are getting Cliff and Sydney really scared. You can tell they're plotting out an escape plan in their heads right now, but for now they move on together. But Cliff and Sydney manage to get some alone time and Cliff gets back to the site to check the photo of the suspects. I really can't make out the faces from those pictures and I'm not sure they can either, but it seems like they're now suspecting Nick and Gina, even though Sydney seems to be finding it hard to believe that these sweethearts are the murderers. But then they figure Nick and Gina were in Oahu too, so she gets a little suspicious. You know who else is getting suspicious? Nick and Gina themselves. They're wondering what the newlyweds could be talking about, but they play it cool. A few moments later, it starts raining and Sydney is trying to get her husband to be a little less paranoid and just enjoy their honeymoon. You look at that face and you already know that that's not happening, but he has to pretend at least, because they're back with the other couple. The ladies are trying to cook up something while the men are setting up camp. Nick seems to see something move in the woods and he moves to attack it, but he turns back and says it's nothing, probably just a goat. Along the line, Nick tells Cliff he lacks situational awareness and brags about how aware he is of his surroundings the moment he gets on a plane, for example. Then he says, if you wait till an emergency happens before you decide what to do, you're already dead. Wow, that means I've been already dead so many times before. Gina says Nick is really hard to kill and you can tell from their faces that is not what Sydney and Cliff want to hear right now, because if it gets down to it, they would prefer if killing this guy wasn't as difficult as give me God of War. Anyway, Nick and Cliff now head into the woods to hunt goats, and it's surely the wrongest place Cliff expected Nick to confront him. Nick turns to Cliff with a bow and arrow in his hands and tells him he knows it has crossed his mind that he and Gina are the murderous couple, but that's quickly sorted out, as Nick says they're actually not in the woods to hunt goats, they're here to hunt the killers. Cliff is worried about Sydney, but Nick tells him that Gina can take care of her, and she seems like she's doing a good job taking care of Sydney, because she's keeping her calm, engaging her in conversations, and even offering her a smoke. Sydney says they've been working on having kids. They want 5. Ain't nobody got time for that. Things are great and she just wants a simple life, but Gina says when people tell her about how perfect their lives are, she just doesn't believe them. That makes Sydney start opening up about the ugliness in her life. Her parents used to domestically abuse each other before they split up, and she grew up in foster care. Relatable. Just kidding. She also tells Gina a couple other traumatizing stories about her childhood, including how she met a bad boy named Rocky, who seemed to change her life forever. Oh, I know this movie. She's surprised that she has said so much about herself to someone she just met. By the way, can you guess who Rocky is? Just take a wild guess. Well, let's head back to the woods. Nick has gone too far forward when Cliff catches sight of Kale and Cleo sitting around a campfire, so he has to approach them alone since he can't really make so much noise to get Nick's attention. He watches them from a distance for a few moments until some guy comes and startles him from behind. Cliff tackles him to the ground and almost hits him, but he quickly introduces himself as the guy from the store. He says he followed Cliff because he thought he needed help. His name is Chronic and he's a guide. Cliff apologizes and said he was just a little paranoid because of the recent reports of murders in the news. Chronic doesn't even know what he's talking about. He says he doesn't watch the news. It's too informational. I feel you, brother. Cliff invites him back to camp, but he says he's good. He just hands over his permit to him and leaves. Cliff heads back over to camp and Nick appears shortly after with a goat he just clapped. And not in the fun way. Gina quickly gets to work cutting the goat up and they cook it for dinner. But Cliff and Sydney are not exactly thankful for dinner. They're in their tent now talking about how crazy Nick and Gina are and are trying to find a way to get out of here. Sydney says they should make up an excuse and just leave, but Cliff thinks that's not smart. He suggests they just ride this out until they can get to the beach, which is 2 miles away. That's a long distance to just ride out, but what can they do? It's time for the screenwriter and his new bride to become the actors in their honeymoon movie. They have to make sure their face doesn't give away their paranoia or suspicion. Can they do this? Join us tomorrow morning. Same time, same station to find out. Tonight, they sleep. The next day, they're woken up bright and early by a police chopper making loud announcements over them. They come out of their tent to see Nick and Gina already awake and active. And guess who the cops are here for? Kale and Cleo. They cuff them and put them in the chopper. Meanwhile, one of the cops checks through what I believe are Kale's things and finds a bunch of teeth there. And I don't remember him being a dentist. Cliff and Cleo feel better now. They look a lot more relieved. They continue their walk with Nick and Gina and they even stop somewhere to take pictures. And they finally get to the beach where a bunch of ladies are doing sussy yoga and a bunch of other stuff is happening too. Football, running around, you know, just stuff you do by the beach. Then we see Cliff literally begging Nick to join him to kayak, but Nick says he has covert plans. But with some good old peer pressure, he joins Nick. As they go into the water, Gina picks up Sydney's camera to record the boys for a bit. After a few seconds of recording, she decides to look through the pictures on the camera. She's seeing pictures from the wedding, but then all of a sudden, her countenance just changes and boom, she drops the camera and straight away starts waving to Nick to come back. But Nick is already too far to actually hear what she's saying. She's frantically waving her arms, but Nick and Cliff just keep going. She takes out her phone and tries to call Nick, but the call fails. But then she gets an idea. She picks up an axe and quickly runs up the hill. Sydney now picks up the camera and sees the picture, which changed Gina's mood, so she immediately chases after Gina. Surely, she knows what's up. It's now Nick's turn to be suspicious. It's written all over his face as he kayaks with Cliff, but then he probably believes in himself, and now he's just lying down and laughing with him. He takes a sip of his drink and drops the bottle in the water. He now slowly starts taking out his knife, but that's too slow for Cliff, who quickly takes out a pistol and tells Nick that his stories were great, but his situational awareness, not so much. As he says that, we see Gina appear above them. Then Cliff says, "Call me Nick," and motions to shoot at Nick. But we're quickly taken back to when he and his wife killed some other man and robbed him. They don't just leave their victim there. They make sure to cut off fingernails and teeth and dispose of them, because rule number 1 is to never give forensics a break. Now we see them changing their look and trying to copy a new accent from a movie. They do that, then head out, and that's where we hear rule number 2. Always keep your game face on. In case you haven't figured it out, what these two do is, they find a couple, clap them, and then take on their identity, until they find another couple whose identity they want to take. And like that, I have one word of advice for you guys. Just be yourself. Anyway, they get on a boat and get their pictures taken. Just then we see Nick and Gina miss that boat, so they decide to head into a shop where Gina checks out some rings. Nick comes back later to check out the rings, and he tells the attendant that he has covert plans for a sunset proposal, and he doesn't want it to be underwhelming for Gina. He comes out and they leave. As they're walking, they see a body being carried away. Still in this flashback, we see Cliff at his hotel checking out his permits. Then he goes out to spy on a couple who are only trying to enjoy a good time together on the beach. We now fast forward in the flashback, them checking out a picture of Kale and Cleo, and then we get to that time that Cliff went through Kale's bag. He wasn't really looking for his permits. He was actually planting those teeth in there. Yes, those teeth the cops found. In fact, he called the cops. Remember that time he met Chronic in the woods? Yeah, he told them that Kale had a 9mm with him and told them to call the cops. Then later, when Cliff and Sydney are planning to clap Nick and Gina, Sydney tells Cliff that she thinks they're rushing, and Cliff thinks it's because she's getting to like Gina. She says no, she's actually beginning to like Sydney. She doesn't want to change identity yet. Now we get to the beach where everything happened and Sydney is literally begging Cliff to say sweet stuff to her, but he just tells her that she's the only person he can love in the world, and that she's the one who will help him lead 100 different lives. She now tells him to always be sincere even if he's not. She goes on to say that in some bent way, his need for detachment fits her need for attachment. And what would this guy say? That he loves the idea of loving her, not actually loving her, you know, the idea. But guess what? She loves hearing that. She's asking if that makes her crazy. He'll tell you no, but sweetheart, the answer is yes. It actually does make you crazy. Anyway, we're now back to the present and we see Cliff let the shot go, and Nick falls straight into the water. He looks up and shoots at Gina, but she manages to dodge the bullets. She gets up and sees Sydney running towards her at full speed with a knife in her hand. She picks up her axe, but it's too late. Gina runs into her and the axe falls off her hand and into the water. In fact, it nearly hits Cliff, but he manages to move out the way. The women are now fighting. Gina is really getting her ass beat, but when Sydney goes to pick her knife to finish her off, she finds the strength to pull out one trick and throw Sydney off the cliff and down into the water to go meet Cliff. Gina now takes out her phone and tries to find reception, but she looks in the water and can't see anyone. That's not a good sign. She goes looking for them, and then she gets a call from an unknown caller. It's from AT&T. She doesn't care. She tells him the situation and tells him to get the police out here ASAP. Her battery is low though, so she's running against the clock. As she's still talking, she sees Gina out on the boat, and boom, out of nowhere, Cliff appears and tries to grab her by the leg. He doesn't succeed, so he just starts shooting. That still doesn't get her, so he's now trying to climb up to get her, but Gina wasn't about to let that happen. She just picks up the knife and stabs him with it. But this guy is one hell of a relentless criminal, because that doesn't stop him at all. He climbs up and still goes searching for Gina. Okay, wait a minute. Nick is actually not dead. The love of his life told you he's so hard to kill, but you didn't believe her. He picks up his axe and goes to save his wife-to-be. He looks at the ring he got her for some inspiration. Wholesome. As Gina is running, she runs into some guys who say they're EMTs and are here to help her, but she's paranoid and you can understand why. Cliff shows up and acts like he's a friend. He tells the guys that she has a problem with Crystal, and that's why she's acting like this. But one of the guys figures him out. He says Gina's pupils are normal, while his are super big. Oh brother, you should not have said anything. Now he's going to clap you. Yep, called it. He shoots all four of the guys, but it's really Gina's lucky day because when he tries to shoot her, his gun jams. And then boom, from nowhere, Nick jumps down and lands on Cliff and completely divides his palm. He can't even hold his gun, so he's just shooting aimlessly. Nick easily walks up to him, grabs the revolver, points it at his chin, and asks him, how many people? Cliff just says, enough that you get good at it. He starts taunting Nick and tells him to shoot. And just about at that time, a police chopper arrives above them. Sydney has managed to manipulate the cops to make herself the good guy to them, and seeing Nick kneeling above Cliff with the gun pointed at him surely doesn't help his case. The cops are about to shoot at Nick while Cliff is literally begging Nick to shoot him, but Gina intervenes and forces Nick to surrender. He does, and the cops stand off. Gina goes straight to Cliff and kicks him in the face before she goes back to hug the love of her life. As they're hugging, Sydney has her come to Jesus moment. She tells the cops that the man they're actually looking for, the one she let mess up her entire life, is Cliff, so they take him out. Now we see Nick do the weirdest proposal you will ever see. He's in the chopper wounded, his head and torso wrapped up with bandages, and he just sits up a little and hands over this ring he got from eBay to his injured girlfriend. She puts it on herself. No need to get on one knee or anything. And guess what? He's had this ring for a year and a half and has just been waiting for the right moment. And well, does it get righter than this? They embrace, and almost at the exact same time, they both say to each other, no honeymoon. Cliff and Sydney have ruined honeymoon for them, and for me too, to be honest. As if I'd ever be in that situation though. Anyway, that was the getaway. Seems perfect to me. Moral of the story? Remember, no honeymoon.